You knew them by the glow, that warm orange light behind the radio in the living room, behind the television set that took 30 seconds to come alive, behind the hi-fi console where your father played his records on Sunday afternoon. You did not know the word for them yet, but you knew the glow, you knew the heat, you knew the hum, and you knew that when one of those little glass bottles went dark, something in your house stopped working. That was the radio tube, and you, your generation, killed it. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. That glow was not decoration. It was the sound of everything you listened to. Every station your father tuned in on the AM dial, every baseball game that came through the speaker on a summer night with the windows open and the crickets outside competing with the announcer, every episode of The Lone Ranger, every news bulletin that made your mother stop washing dishes and stand still in the kitchen doorway. That sound came through glass, through gas, through a piece of technology that was alive in a way that nothing in electronics has been alive since. You could see it working. You could feel the heat on the back of your hand when you reached behind the cabinet. You could smell it, that faint, warm scent of dust burning off hot glass that every house in America had and nobody ever talked about. The radio tube was not complicated, a glass envelope, metal pins at the bottom, a filament inside that glowed orange when you turned the set on, and it did one simple, magnificent thing. It took a whisper of an electrical signal and made it loud enough to fill a room. Every radio, every television, every amplifier, every piece of electronic equipment that made sound or pictures between 1920 and 1970 had these glass tubes inside it, lined up in rows like little soldiers, each one doing its job, each one glowing. A typical radio had 5 to 8 of them. A television had 15 to 25. A hi-fi amplifier had anywhere from 4 to a dozen. And they all burned out eventually, not all at once, one at a time. And when one went, you knew. The sound went thin on one side, the picture rolled, a channel disappeared, and that was when something happened that would be unthinkable today. You fixed it yourself, not a repairman, not a service center, not a website with a chat window and a robot that asks you to describe your problem in 50 words or fewer. You, a 13-year-old kid who had watched his father do it twice and figured he could handle it. You unplugged the set. You waited. You unscrewed the back panel, 4 Phillips head screws, sometimes 6, and you set it against the wall. And there they were, 15, 20, 25 glass tubes standing in their sockets like a tiny glass city, most of them still glowing that deep amber orange, each one warm enough that you could feel the heat on your face from a foot away. You smelled it, that warm electric smell, dust and hot glass and something else. Something you never smelled anywhere else in your life except behind a radio or a television that was running. You look for the dark one, the one that was not glowing. Sometimes you tap them gently with your finger and one would flicker. That was your suspect. You wrapped your fingers around it and pulled. It came out with a soft pop, pins sliding out of the socket. You held it up to the light. Sometimes you could see the broken filament inside. Sometimes it looked fine, and you would not know until you tested it. You dropped it in a paper bag. You pulled 2 or 3 more that looked suspicious, and you went somewhere. We are not going to tell you where. You know where you went. Every man watching this knows exactly where he went with that paper bag. You tested them. You found the bad one. You bought a replacement for 60 cents. You drove home. You pushed the new tube into the socket. It's seated with a firm click, pins lining up with the holes, and you screwed the back panel on and plugged the set in and held your breath. The screen flickered, the sound came back, the picture steadied. It worked. You fixed it. You were 13 years old and you fixed a television set that contained enough voltage to kill you, and nobody thought that was unusual because that is what people did. Try that today. Try opening the back of your television today. There is no back to open. There are no screws. There are no parts you can see or touch or test or replace. There is nothing inside that a human being is meant to interact with. When your television breaks today, you search for the customer service number online and wait on hold for 45 minutes, and then a voice tells you that your warranty expired 3 months ago and the repair would cost more than a new set. So you throw it away. You put a $600 television on the curb and you drive to the store and you buy another one. You throw away something that would have taken your father an evening and 60 cents to fix, and you do not feel good about it. You know something is wrong with that. You have always known. But this is not a story about what we lost. This is a story about what those little glass tubes are worth today, and the number is going to shock you. The tube was born in 1904 in a physics laboratory in London. A British engineer named John Ambrose Fleming built the first one. 2 years later, an American named Lee DeForest added a third electrode and invented the triode, the tube that could amplify. That single invention made radio possible, then television, then radar, then the first computers. For half a century, the vacuum tube was the most important component in all of electronics. Every major company in the world manufactured them. RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Tung-Sol, Mullard, Telefunken, Philips. They competed to build the best tubes the way car companies competed to build the best engines, because tubes were the engine of everything. And then on a December afternoon in 1947, 3 physicists at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey demonstrated something new. A tiny device made from a sliver of germanium that could do what a tube did, amplify a signal, but without the glass, without the heat, without the size, and without the 60-cent replacement every few months. They called it the transistor. All 3 men won the Nobel Prize. The transistor did not kill the tube overnight. For most of the 1950s, the two technologies existed side by side. Your radio still had tubes. Your television still had tubes. Your father's hi-fi amplifier still glowed orange in the cabinet, but the math was moving. Transistors were smaller, cheaper. They did not burn out. They did not need 30 seconds to warm up. And when integrated circuits arrived in the early 1960s with millions of transistors on a single chip, the economics became impossible. You were part of it. You might not have known it at the time, but you were part of the killing. You bought a transistor radio, a small one. It fit in your shirt pocket and ran on a single 9-volt battery, and it did not glow, and it did not get warm, and it played the same stations your father's big console played, except you could take it anywhere. You could take it to the ball field and listen to the game while you played catch. You could take it to the garage while you worked on your bicycle. You could sit on the back porch with it on a Saturday afternoon and hear music that your parents would not have let you play on the living room hi-fi. And at night, that is when the transistor radio became something else entirely. You put it under your pillow, you pressed your ear against it, and with the lights off and the house quiet, you turned the dial slowly and the stations slid past like voices from other worlds. A disc jockey in Chicago, a country station from Nashville, a rock and roll station from New York that came in clear for 10 minutes and then faded into static and then came back again. You heard songs you had never heard. You heard voices from cities you had never visited. You were 12 years old, lying in the dark, listening to America through a device the size of a pack of cigarettes, and your parents had no idea. That little radio was a miracle. It was freedom. It was your first secret. And it was a murder weapon because every transistor radio sold was a vote against the tube. And you voted. One by one, the tube factories closed. RCA shut down its tube lines. General Electric stopped production. Sylvania, Tung-Sol, Mullard, Telefunken, factory after factory on 3 continents went dark. The workers who had spent their careers learning how to make these delicate glass instruments were let go. They scattered into other industries, and the knowledge they carried, how to coat a cathode, how to seal a glass envelope, how to test for microphonics, that knowledge walked out the door with them and never came back. By the mid-1970s, the consensus across the entire electronics industry was unanimous. The tube was dead. The future was solid state, and anyone still using tubes was holding on to the past. Except the tube was not dead, not even close. It had retreated from the living room and the kitchen table, but it had dug in somewhere else, in places most people never thought to look. If you have a microwave oven in your kitchen right now, you own a vacuum tube. The magnetron that heats your food is a vacuum tube. The same type of tube that powered World War II radar is sitting 3 feet from your coffee maker. There are more than 1 billion of them in active use around the world right now. 1 billion! And nobody makes a solid-state replacement that can match the price. The military never gave up tubes either. Long-range naval radar still runs on tube-based transmitters. Satellite communication systems depend on traveling wave tube amplifiers. Electronic warfare equipment, the systems that protect aircraft carriers and fighter jets, uses tubes because no transistor can match the raw radio frequency power that a tube can deliver at those frequencies. The defense sector accounts for 45% of the thermionic tube market today. Nations depend on a technology they told the world was obsolete. And then there is Voyager. Launched by NASA in 1977, Voyager 1 is now the most distant human-made object in existence. 15.8 billion miles from Earth, traveling through interstellar space. And the component keeping it in contact with home is a traveling wave tube amplifier that has been running continuously for 49 years. A vacuum tube in outer space for half a century. Still working, still sending data from a place no human-made object has ever been. But the part of this story that hits closest to home is not military radar or deep space, it is music. If you have ever heard an electric guitar played through a tube amplifier, you have heard something that no digital technology has ever been able to fully replicate. The warm, dynamic overdrive. The way the sound responds to how hard you hit the strings, the compression that feels natural instead of processed. Fender, Marshall, Vox, Mesa Boogie, Orange, all of them still make tube amplifiers today. In 2024, tube guitar amplifiers accounted for 38% of total revenue in that segment. Not because musicians are sentimental, because professionals choose the tool that sounds best and tubes sound best. The hi-fi world never forgot either. It never even pretended to forget. A vintage Macintosh MC275 tube amplifier, the one with the chrome chassis and the row of output tubes glowing behind the glass, sells for $5,000 or more today. Marantz tube receivers from the 1960s go for $3,000 to $10,000. Fisher, Scott, Dynaco, the names your father knew, the equipment he saved up for, the amplifier that sat in the living room console and made Sinatra sound like he was standing in your kitchen. That equipment is worth more now than it was new, not less, more. Because the people who hear it understand something that the specifications cannot explain. There is a man who has 200,000 tubes in his collection. He and his friends started collecting them in the 1960s. Everything from Western Electric tubes from the 1920s to the last Compactrons General Electric ever made. Companies and individuals have offered him serious money for the lot. He repairs vintage hi-fi equipment in his spare time. He owns a pair of Klipschorn speakers from the late 1950s, enormous horn-loaded cabinets that stand in the corners of a room like furniture. He connects a 10-watt tube amplifier to those speakers and invites people to listen. 10 watts. That is nothing by modern standards. But through those horns, with those tubes, 10 watts fills a room with a sound so clear and so present that people stop talking. They sit down, they close their eyes, and when they open them, they have a look on their face that he has seen 100 times. It is the look of someone who just realized what has been missing from every piece of audio equipment they have owned for the last 40 years. That look is the entire story of the vacuum tube in one expression. In March of 2022, the world discovered just how dependent it still was on vacuum tubes. Following the conflict in Ukraine, Russia imposed an export ban on over 200 categories of goods. Vacuum tubes were on the list. A company called Electro-Harmonics operated a tube factory in Saratov, Russia, producing tubes under 7 brand names at once: Tung-Sol, Electro-Harmonics, Genelex Gold Lion, Mullard, Svetlana, Sovtek, E.H. Gold. All 7 went dark overnight. Tube prices spiked within days. Vendors pulled their websites offline. Musicians and recording studios scrambled to stockpile whatever they could find. A technology that the world had declared dead 60 years earlier had just caused a global supply chain crisis. The restrictions were eventually resolved, but the lesson was permanent. The vacuum tube supply chain was concentrated in a handful of countries, and a single geopolitical event could sever it in a week. That crisis accelerated something that had been building quietly for years. Western Electric, once the manufacturing arm of AT&T and Bell Telephone, had been revived by an entrepreneur named Charles Whitener, who bought the trademark in 1995 and restarted production of the legendary 300B Triode. In 2026, at a major audio exposition, Western Electric announced plans to bring production of the 12AX7, the single most widely used preamp tube on the planet, back to American soil. For the first time in decades, vacuum tubes are being manufactured in the United States again. The global vacuum tube market is currently valued at approximately $3 billion. It is projected to surpass $5 billion within the decade. The technology that was declared dead in the 1960s is not only alive, it is growing faster than most of the industries that replaced it. And somewhere in a garage or a basement or a closet, there is a cardboard box. It has not been opened in 40 years. Inside that box are small glass tubes with metal pins, some still in their original paper sleeves, some loose, some with markings you can barely read. You put them in that box the year you bought your first solid-state television. You were going to throw them away, but something stopped you. Something said, keep them. You were right. You were right about the sound. You were right about the glow. You were right about the warmth. You were right that something was different about tube audio and tube equipment and the world you grew up in, where a man could fix his own radio with a glass tube and 60 cents. The world told you that technology was obsolete. The world spent 60 years telling you it was dead, and now the world is paying $3 billion a year for it, because it turns out you were right all along.